Last time we talked about how the Romans expanded at an incredible rate, and how Claudius, the new emperor, needed to win political favor. His solution was to invade the island of Britain, and do what Julius Caesar never could: conquer the supposedly ruthless barbarians known collectively as the Britons. As we learned, though, the Britons were actually incredibly fractured and broken up into smaller tribes and kingdoms. Each tried to leverage the Romans against each other, but of course the Romans ended up conquering a lot of Britain. I mentioned at the end of the last video that the new Roman governor went back on the promises the guy before him made with some of the tribes in Britain. Governors were in charge of provinces, and since asking the headquarters in Rome every time a decision needed to be made was very impractical, since it was so far away, they were the highest authority and acted on the behalf of Rome. When the Roman governor betrayed the promises made, there was no one the Britons could appeal to in order to get the decision changed, and rebellion seemed to be the only answer. This happened in 47 AD, when the leader of the Iceni tribe led a revolt against the Romans that was rapidly quelled, or stopped, with a big show of force to persuade others not to rebel. The new king of the Iceni, Prasutagus, named his two daughters and the Roman Emperor Nero the heirs to his throne and possessions. This was to try and win support from the Romans and, in the words of Tacitus, put his kingdom and his house out of the reach of wrong. After he died in the year 60 AD, though, the complete opposite happened. Centurions, Roman officers, plundered or looted his kingdom. Tacitus tells us, all the chief men of the Iceni were stripped of their ancestral possessions, and the king's relatives were made slaves. Next was the final straw for the Iceni. The king's wife was publicly beaten, and her daughters brutalized while the whole town watched. Her name was Boudicca. With no one to appeal to, their honor destroyed, and belongings stolen, the Iceni and Queen Boudicca rallied local tribes in East Anglia and led them in one of the most successful revolts ever undertaken against the Roman Empire. First, the Britons attacked the city of Camulodunum, now known as Colchester. The town was almost completely undefended, as the Roman governor was attempting to conquer Wales and wipe out the Druids there, which is a topic for another video altogether. The troops that plundered the Iceni lived in the Colonia in Camulodunum, and it seems like they enjoyed taking advantage of the surrounding population quite often. Colonia was like a retirement home for Roman soldiers, and it served to cement Rome's claim in an area. Tacitus explains it was against these veterans that their hatred was most intense, because they drove people out of their homes, ejected them from their farms, and called them captives and slaves. To make it worse, soldiers active in the military would turn a blind eye to these crimes because they hoped that when they retired, they would be able to do the same things to the locals. There were only 200 soldiers in Camulodunum at the time of the attack, and thanks to Boudicca's spies, all of their attempts to fortify the city were useless. According to Tacitus, they fell upon our troops, stormed the forts, and burst into the colony itself, the headquarters, as they thought, of tyranny. Everything was either plundered or burned, and thanks to charred remains, archaeologists estimate the fire reached about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is over 500 degrees centigrade. After 2 days, the Roman veterans and soldiers, most of whom had taken shelter in the stone temple in Camulodunum, were overrun. Next, Boudicca's army moved to attack Londinium, modern-day London, plundering and burning everything in their paths. Roman reinforcements had arrived before the looting of Londinium, but the commander Suetonius made the decision to let it burn instead of fighting the Britons before he was ready. Basically, he didn't want his small force of less than 10,000 troops to be completely overwhelmed by the force of 70,000 citizens and allies, or 230,000, depending on whether you believe Tacitus or Cassius Dio, who seems slightly more unreliable, but again, that's a whole different video altogether. Instead, he found a place where he could engage Boudicca's army in a pitched battle, something the Romans were perfect at. A forest protected his back, and an open field was in front of him. Boudicca took the bait, and, after a rousing speech, the contents of which we can only guess about, charged her forces straight at the Romans. After a volley of javelins, the Romans drew out their swords and charged, obliterating the Britons, whose only escape was cut off by a supply train of wagons and women onlookers who, according to Tacitus, were there to witness the victory they felt sure was coming. Almost all of the Britons were killed, including the animals pulling the wagons, but Boudicca survived the battle. She died shortly after the battle of sickness or self-ingested poison, thus marking the end of a unified resistance to the Romans in Britain. Boudicca's legacy lives on in the United Kingdom today, and there's even a statue of her riding in her chariot in London. She's still one of the main figures studied in schools and is a very big part of the culture and history of the United Kingdom. Okay, some discussion questions. Number 1. Why do you think Boudicca is still revered in the United Kingdom today? Number 2. If you were Boudicca, what would you have done differently?